I want to thank the sisters, and particularly the liturgical committee, for inviting me to offer this reflection. I'm very touched, and I understand it as a great honor. The gospel reading for the Feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel is taken from the concluding section of the Passion narrative as recounted in the Gospel of John. Jesus is dying. He has been tortured, mocked, and sentenced to death, capital punishment by way of crucifixion. The carpenter was forced to carry the wood of his execution to a hill outside the great city of Jerusalem. There, Jesus was stripped naked, his arms stretched out, his wrists nailed to the beam. Then soldiers used ropes to hoist him up and nail his feet to the upright stake. Jesus is dying. He cannot breathe. His diaphragm is collapsing. He is being asphyxiated. As death comes over him, Jesus calls out to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." He entrusts his deeply loved mother to his deeply loved disciple and friend. "Here is your mother." Jesus gasps, "It is finished." His head sags, and he gives up his spirit. What might we make of this scene so soaked in sadness and anguish? From a human and compassionate perspective, Jesus, in his dying moments, performs an act of filial piety, entrusting his mother's well-being to the care of a beloved disciple and friend. Biblical scholars do not dismiss such a reading out of hand, but given the highly symbolic character of the Johannine Gospel, they dig deeper. Adele Reinhardt argues that a clue to the meaning of the passage may lie in a comparison between these two characters. Each is defined by the quality of intimacy with Jesus, mother and beloved disciple and friend. Scholars suggest that a further clue may lie in the Gospel's use and emphasis on the language of dwelling or abiding. The mother will now dwell, abide, with her new son, just as Jesus dwelt, abided among humankind, just as the promised Spirit Paraclete will descend upon and dwell, abide, with the disciples. The book of Acts reports that after the ascension, the disciples, men and women, meet in an upper room of a house to pray. Miriam, Mary, the mother of Jesus, or Luke names her, Miriam is with them. Christian iconography reckons more and depicts Mary with the disciples at the descent of Spirit Ruah. On this feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, let us take the opportunity to re-encounter the Jewish peasant woman from Galilee, who is the mother of Jesus. Miriam, Mary of Nazareth, remains elusive, hidden, nearly invisible in the New Testament. Yet Christian iconography and hagiography make her visible, fashions her through a patriarchal lens, confines her to pedestals, renders her difficult, well nigh impossible for an ordinary woman of any era to imitate. But critical biblical scholarship and feminist theology can help us find Miriam, the flesh and blood Jewish woman, mother, disciple. Mary of Nazareth grew up and lived under the Roman Imperium, which manifested its rule in Galilee through the line of Herodian kings. The population of the obscure village of Nazareth was comprised roughly of 300 to 400 people, most of whom were peasants working their own land or tenant farmers working land belonging to others, along with a few artisans and craftspersons and perhaps merchants. Archaeological findings show that in villages like Nazareth, family dwellings consisted of one or two cramped rooms covered with a thatched roof. Often 3 or 4 such houses were joined by a common wall and faced a common open-air courtyard, forming a compound where extended family groups might live. The common courtyard functioned as a shelter for domestic animals as well as a kitchen with its shared oven, cistern that held water, and millstone for grinding grain. Theirs was subsistence living, growing their own food, building their own shelter, sewing their own clothes from cloth that they spun and wove from the wool of sheep. Nazareth would have had a small synagogue where men and women gathered to pray, to listen to the reading and interpretation of Torah, and to receive religious instruction. More than likely, male heads of households led synagogue services and settled the community's disputes. But scholars also observe that in such small rural villages, women would have been active in synagogue and in public life. Moreover, as Elizabeth Johnson surmises, celebrations of the life cycle, such as circumcisions, marriage feasts, and funerals, would also have entailed the participation of women according to local tradition. Although married to Joseph, a carpenter with a skilled trade, like every other village peasant woman, Mary would have worked long hours each day. Certainly, she would have cared for her child and perhaps, from time to time, the children of other women. Each morning, she would have risen early to draw water and prepare a meal. She would have collected firewood, planted and tended a vegetable and herb garden, sewed and mended the family clothes, and quite likely, her face and skin would have been scorched and weathered by work in the sun, her hands rough, her feet calloused, her back sore, and sometimes her patience worn thin. Still, Mary's life was not without joy or gladness. She enjoyed the intimacy of marital affection, the warmth of kinfolk, the confidences of women friends, the conviviality of village community. As a mother, Mary would have been awed at the birth of her son. Surely she marveled at holding him, nursing him, singing to him, simply gazing at her infant Jesus. Surely she smiled as he took his first steps, or discovered birds, or looked up at the stars. Surely Mary taught Jesus to be attentive to and to listen to those around him, to refrain from hasty judgment, to be compassionate, and to help others as he could. Surely Mary taught Jesus to pause and to ponder and to pray. This brief sketch reminds us that Mary of Nazareth was a flesh and blood Jewish woman who lived in first century Galilee. For many of us, this portrait contrasts sharply with the Mary of popular Catholic devotion and iconography. The Galilean peasant woman is not the blue-cloaked Mary whose head is tilted to one side, whose eyes are modestly cast downward, whose lips bear the hint of a demure smile. It is the Galilean peasant woman who is bowed down with grief at the foot of the cross, weeping for her dying son. This is the woman whom Our Lady of Mount Carmel shows us today. To return to the gospel, faithful to Jesus to the end are two persons whom he loved deeply and who loved him deeply: his mother and his disciple and friend. In the fourth gospel, these two figures function symbolically, bringing the past and future together. Jesus' mother represents the past, the beloved disciple, the future. From the beginning, Jesus' mother has been a witness to his ministry. Her presence at the cross represents the continuation of his now concluded earthly ministry. The presence of the beloved disciple symbolically connects the Jesus tradition and the life of the faith community. Finally, in the Johannine Gospel, at the heart of Jesus' ministry is the creation of a new family of God. The members of this family will not be born of flesh, Jesus says to Nicodemus, but rather of water and spirit. The members of this family will claim no father except God alone, and they will worship God in spirit and in truth, Jesus tells the Samaritan woman. To belong to God's new creation, to belong to this new family, means to follow the way that Jesus taught. Moreover, following that way requires that we root our fundamental identity not in national dominance or religious orthodoxy, not in culture or political affiliation, not in racial primacy or ethnic purity, not in gender superiority or sexual orientation. Rather, we are to root our fundamental identity in concrete praxis of love of God and love of neighbor. The author of the first letter of John writes, "Whoever does not love abides in death." And again, little children, let us love, not in word or speech, but in truth and in action. In our broken and hurting world, Our Lady of Mount Carmel shows us the face of the Theotokos, the God-bearer, the Mother of God. She turns us to the Galilean peasant woman Miriam of Nazareth, mother of the crucified Jesus, our mother. Having been driven into exile by gangs of soldiers sent to kill her son, Miriam of Nazareth has much in common with mothers around the world who faced danger, detention, and death, who risk abuse and rape to cross foreign borders so that their children might live and thrive. Having worked long hours to provide for her family, Miriam of Nazareth has much in common with the impoverished mothers around the world, ordinary and poor women of indigenous communities, women of color, white women, mothers whose children are intentionally deprived of food and medicine and healthcare because of race, ethnicity, religion, or culture through the indifference and cruelty of their governments. Having cared for a friend or neighbor's child sick from disease in rural Galilee, Miriam of Nazareth has much in common with mothers around the world whose husbands or children, relatives, or friends have suffered and died from COVID-19. Here in our fractured and failing nation, Our Lady of Mount Carmel shows us the face of the Theotokos, the God-bearer, the Mother of God. She turns us to the Galilean peasant woman, Miriam of Nazareth, mother of the crucified Jesus, our mother. With a son arrested and brutalized by law enforcement, tried, convicted, and executed on trumped-up charges of sedition and blasphemy, Miriam of Nazareth has a great deal in common with the mothers of Tamir Rice and Andy Lopez, the mothers of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, the mothers of Tanisha Anderson and Natasha McKenna, the mothers of Eric Garner and Freddie Gray, the mothers of Amadou Diallo and Botham Jean, the mothers of Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor. As George Floyd lay under the weight of white supremacy, gasping for air, struggling to breathe, he called out to his mother. And at that moment, he summoned all mothers. He summoned the anguished woman captured by Titus Kaphar on the cover of Time magazine. He summoned Our Lady of Perpetual Help, Mary, Mother of the Oppressed. He summoned Our Lady of Ferguson, Our Lady of Mount Carmel. As George Floyd lay pressed under the knee of white supremacy, gasping for air, struggling to breathe, he called out to his mother. At that moment, Miriam of Nazareth embraced him and took him as her son.